Welcome to this video on the English symmetrical variation. And if you have clicked this video, you have already seen that the moves I'm recommending start with first c4 and then c5. And now white has two choices. He can either play g3 or knight c3 basically to come into the symmetrical variation. He can also play knight f3 followed with d4, or combine this idea with e3 and then play d4. And those moves will be discussed later on. But the first move I'm gonna look at is knight c3 or g3, which generally is a transposition. Here I suggest to play g6. It's also possible to start with knight c6. But there's always a little problem when white plays, for example, this knight f3 and then goes for either e3, d4, or plays the d4 move immediately, because then you've always got to take on d4, because d5 usually is a problem. So for simplicity, I suggest we always start with g6. Now, white plays g3. And we reach this symmetrical position. The key idea for black is to control the dark squares, especially the d4 square. And for example, for white, it's the similar idea. He wants to control the light squares, especially the d5 square. Now, there are different setups for white here. White can go for the knight f3 move and then play d3, bishop d2, for example, castle short, and play in the absolute symmetrical variation. But he has also got those e3, knight e2, d4 ideas, and also knight f3, e3, d4 ideas. We will look at the absolute symmetrical variation here, and I will show you the setup I recommend for black. So knight f3, and I would like to bring the knight to e7, so the bishop, the knight, and the pawn still control d4. But here's a little problem. If we start with the move e6 here, white has this very strange tactical idea with d4. And if we take knight b5, suddenly you see white wants to recapture on d4 or go knight to d6 check. So there is some theory on this, and it can continue, for example, just with d5, captures, threatening to capture on c6, queen a5 check, and yeah, we have those exchanges, and then knight e7. I looked at this capture on c6, and of course black is a pawn up, but there's some strange compensation with a4, for example, queen to b7, and then knight c4, threatening knight d6 check. And you cannot play, for example, queen to b4 check, because there's bishop d2 and then rook c1. And after the queen moves, bishop takes c6 check, which means black would have to play knight e7 here. And there's also this forcing line, a4, queen to b6, knight c4, still is basically the same idea here. But this time white only wins the bishop pair, and this is probably playable. Those moves were forced, and we reached this position, and white wants to push with b4. He has a small majority on the queen side. There are possibilities with bishop b5 maybe. And generally speaking, I'm not sure I trust this position for black. I think it's slightly better for white, and therefore I suggest not to play the move e6, not the move e6 here. I suggest to play the move d6 first, to stop all those tactical ideas. And now the d6 square is protected by a pawn, and therefore d4 doesn't work anymore. So white usually continues with castling short. You can also delay castling and, for example, play d3 here. And you see bishop d2, a3, and b4. that's the main idea of white, where he wants to generate counterplay. It's basically on the queen side. And I suggest to play just the standard setup with e6 now, bishop d2, knight e7, and prepare castling. Maybe knight f5 to come to d4 later. Say, for example, play this queen c1 and really don't want to castle. You can typically answer with knight to f5, not to allow any bishop h6. There's also this a3 move. That's basically the idea, rook b1, b4, but generally we just ignore this. We just play e6, rook b1, the typical idea, yes. And here we could castle short, but as a little rule of thumb, I suggest we don't castle too early. We always wait until white has castled himself. There are some instances where white can generate some possibility of an attack. Just don't worry about that. Just wait with the castling until white has castled as well. Instead, you can just play b6 here. And we want to play this move anyway. We want to play b6, put the bishop on b7, possibly castle short, and then queen to d7, and we have connected the rooks and everything is fine. So that's what we see in the absolute main line. After sixth move, castle short, we play e6. Yes, there are some games where you can play e5. It's also okay to play like that. It's basically the Botvinnik setup, where you then play knight e7 and bishop e6, push for d5. Those ideas exist as well, but e6 is a little bit more flexible. So white plays d3. We will look at e3, d4 later on. So d3, knight e7, and as before, white usually has this little counterplay on the queen side in mind. So they usually play bishop to d2. Yes, there are a lot of people, especially in blitz, that play stuff like rook b1. Then after castling a3, b6, b4, they blunder the knight on c3. You should be aware of that. You might win some blitz games because of that tactic. So usually bishop d2 is needed to protect the knight, sometimes also with the queen c1, bishop h6 idea, as already mentioned. Now just castle short, and white plays a3 with the idea rook b1, b4. Yes, there are also some ideas, for example, to play this e4 setup, the so-called Botvinnik setup. But for those setups, the knight is a little bit misplaced on f3, would be probably a little bit better on e2, and the bishop on d2, yeah, is probably not great, should probably be on e3 to support some d4 push. Will also be covered later on. So a3, b6. Rook b1 and bishop b7, and now we are ready to play queen d7, basically against anything white throws at us. So b4, queen to d7. And now white has several options here how he wants to deal with his queen. You see, here are several plans for black. He can, for example, play knight f5, consider going to d4. You can also play the rook to d8, the other rook to c8, play basically the waiting game. And yes, there is this idea of playing d5 eventually, but you've also got to watch out. If you play d5 too early, they might capture on c5, and this usually ruins black's pawn structure. So keep the pawns a little bit flexible, maybe play a little bit around with rooks, rook d8, rook c8, look and see what white does. For example, I've got some examples here what white might want to throw at you. For example, taking on c5. That's not a good idea usually, because now you can play d takes c5, and you see there's a very easy plan. You play knight f5, e5, and then put a piece on d4. We can, for example, follow this one game, which was played by Flores Diego. Here, white played knight b5, rook d8. Yeah, queen c1, the typical idea of bishop to h6, was stopped with knight to f5, which was a move black wanted to play anyway. Well, hitting the rook has to move. And here, black kicked back the bishop, now protecting the pawn so the knight is freed and can, for example, go to d4. He wants to exchange those bishops, but doesn't change black's plan. He just plays e5. And after bishop a1, knight d4 was played. And just to explain the structure a little bit, the knight is very well placed on d4. And for example, if white were to capture this knight, you can always capture the e-pawn. And now you see why we played e5, why we put a very strong piece on d4, because now you can double up on the e-file, attack this pawn on e2, and white has a lot of problems. Well, in the actual game, white played e3, and after knight e2 resigned, because he loses the queen. So b takes c5, not a good idea for white. Another bad idea for white would be to play this early b5. The b5 move never really impresses here. The problem is it gives this counter push with d5 a lot of strength, because usually d5 doesn't work because white can capture on c5. But with a pawn on b5, this doesn't work anymore for obvious reasons. And the counter push with d5 gets really, really strong. Here, black should probably play knight to d4. And we can go down this pretty much forcing line. Now hitting d6. So d5, hitting two things at the same time. So usually you gotta take it. And knight takes d5. And what black wants to do is bring the queen to d7. Then probably a rook to c8. Well, of course, queen d7 is needed, so knight d6 is not forking. And for example here, queen b3, queen to d7. Well, rook c8 maybe h6, maybe f5. Kick this knight back, and you see there's this c3 square. It's always a question, are you gonna go with your knight to c3? You might end up with a passed pawn there, which might be strong. You have to evaluate that in your own games when the time comes. So let's see. There's also another idea white can try, which is queen to a4. And here I suggest we play rook f to d8. Usually that's the best square for the rook. The other rook might be best placed on c8, but that's not always certain. And I just want to illustrate one very interesting idea here. Rook to c1 and this very strange looking move h6. The idea is to push g5 and then bring the knight to g6 to control the h4 square and then play g4. And you eventually see that black is just pushing pawns on the king side and generating probably an attack which might be dangerous for white eventually. This was an idea that was illustrated by Ikonikov, Vyacheslav Ikonikov. So let's go back to queen to d7. There is also the Wang Yu game, which I would like to show at least the first few moves. White played queen c1, and yes, he wants to play the bishop h6 idea. And here you can also again play knight f5. As usual, when white plays queen to c1, you can answer with knight f5 and control h6 square. And eventually you might go to d4. He played e3. Well, that's obviously to control the d4 square, so the knight doesn't go there. Here rook a c8 was played. And there are little tricks here, like taking on b4 and then play d5. And you see the queen is lined up with the rook, and that's generally speaking a good idea. And that's probably why he preferred rook a c8 over the typical rook f d8 in those structures. Now, white misplayed in this position. He played the move b5, and as I already explained, that never is a really good idea in these structures. Now, black played knight to e5, and we had a few exchanges here, and white played e4 and knight d4, and we basically reach a position that is very similar to a Bitwinic setup. And eventually black won. But there's also, after b5, the option to play just not this move, but knight to e7. And then you push for d5, and you see, for example, I make some random move for white, like a4. And if you push like d5, and I just want to show you the structure here. For example, takes, you can take with a pawn and then maybe push d4. Or, and here you have to basically shortly forget about the tactical problem that e5 would win, but usually those structures are great when you just can target the pawn on d3. Of course, e4 would now be a problem, but just to illustrate it with the knight was not there. But for example, on e7, this would be very, very good for black. So this should be enough to play the symmetrical variation of the English, and I don't think you need much more information to get a good game. Basically, you play d6, e6, and put the knights on c6 and e7, castle short, and fianchetto the bishop to b7 as well. So we will look at the other options in the next video.